I'm recording. So
Okay.
I was thinking about something. What there's the topic of the arbitrary.
Yep.
Do you think what some of the fiction books like Kafka or other existential fiction captures is the is that idea of the absurd? Like the absurd is the arbitrary, meaning there is no meaning to anything. It's all just there's no basis for any sort of
I
in reality.
think a lot of existentialists tend to think that the core of reality is absurd, and the only meaning you could have is something that you've created, which often would be maybe subjective, even sometimes the meaning you find, but there is no like objective meaning to reality, usually because of that absurdity.
And do you think it's connected with the arbitrary in this book? Like it's almost like those are the absurd is the arbitrary. Like it's just their version of that's their
Yeah, I
take
mean
on it.
they recognize what's absurd, but it's their interpretation. What do you do with that absurdity? Like an objectivity, like you reject it as irrelevant to epistemology, but for them it like is why you can't understand reality for sure. Like those arbitrary things, like we can't really ever attain that omniscience, so that we should remain skeptical and even view these things as absurd, and the only meaning we can have is one we create subjectively or whatever meaning we decide to make it.
Yeah.
There's no way to create an objective understanding of what your purpose or meaning is.
So then, because I was looking up short philosophical stories or short stories that had a philosophical point, and one of them was something about like this guy who eats a lobster, and the point was supposed to be that life is just absurd. You don't know what's going to happen. Like you might just eat some other creature that's alive. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I was thinking maybe that's a way to capture like these abstract, like you're talking about the arbitrary. Well, there it is in a short story. Um,
Yeah, I think like you mentioned Kafka. I think his example of arbitrary is usually when other people use the arbitrary on you. It seems to be a lot of what his stories are about. When you get treated by bureaucracy badly, treated by other people badly, is often to do with their arbitrary claims about you that really have no basis in anything.
okay, got it. So it's
Like
his
the
view of, yeah,
maybe his view is that other people are control our lives, or other people ultimately decide our fate, or things like that. That we're not in control of our lives. It's rather other people with whatever irrationalities they have. It
right.
doesn't matter how
So
rational you are, but you can be a victim anytime. Is more
right.
like his view.
Okay. So he's writing more about other people. We can say, what is it? The metaphysics of man? Is that what the
Like
section
social
was in?
metaphysics, maybe. Yeah, you
Okay.
could probably say that. I mean, that's my understanding of how I've read Kafka's stories. It always felt focused on being harmed by others, or in some way your life is made worse by other people.
Okay.
Or the same thing, like hell is other people. Sartre seeing that, like
Right.
things like that.
It is interesting though, because maybe as a child, some of those, like without psychoanalyzing Kafka, but just speaking generally, like a lot of beliefs we form as a child, we can't think properly. And as a child, everything does seem arbitrary. Like people just hit you for no reason. And so,
Yeah,
if you grow up and you don't question those, uh, I don't know, the basis of the feelings you have, then maybe that's one of the results is you start to have that worldview. Do you think that? I haven't read enough Kafka to really know, but
um, yeah, it seems like a fair characterization. That I think there's something to be said about where he grew up, and sort of maybe a conflicted identity, even like he grew up in Bohemia. So and I think he spoke Yiddish or learned Yiddish, but like he couldn't really know where he belonged. Kind of, it
yeah.
seemed like, and that was affected a lot of his beliefs, and
Mm.
that yeah, it just seemed like he couldn't find much meaning in life.
Oh,
It's hard to say why, but it's definitely some influence about. The more you read of him, the more you can tell that there's some pattern or something about him that he likes to write about, like these themes that are common.
Just trying to find that section in the book. It was the section of man, and it said something at the start that what that subject of like the basic view you have of man is, I can't remember what they called it. Do you remember? It's like the metaphysics. It's not the metaphysics of man. It's something else.
Social metaphysics is definitely the phrase. It was
Social.
in, I'm pretty sure that was in Objectivist Ethics by Rand, not in Opar.
No, this is what I'm thinking of. I don't know that, but this is just in Opa chapter 6. It says, "What is man? What kind of being is he? What are his essential attributes?" And it talks about Victor Hugo and Hegel.
Yes.
Hegel saw a half-real fragment of the state. Thomas Hobbes, Kant, Ayn Rand saw Howard Roark and John Galt. And then philosophical inquiry into man is not part of the special sciences. So it's here we go, a study of man's metaphysical nature. That's what I was looking for.
Okay.
So
yes.
Maybe these books, maybe Kafka captures, he's got his own view of the man's metaphysical nature, like what the essence of man is. And so it might be good. Maybe I should read some of that to try and match it up with like these different approaches you can take to metaphysics and epistemology.
Yeah, I mean, even like I've read these authors mentioned by Rand or whatnot. It really gets a better understanding, I think, of what she was referring to when she's thinking about art. Like, if you read Victor Hugo, I understood more concretely what she meant by heroism or like positive view of man and things like that. Because I mean, I've always liked things like Kafka and those dark things, but there's always something that not bothered me about them, but like I never agreed with them. It's like, oh, it's too bad these people are so life in such a negative way. But once I read Victor Hugo, I got a better sense of what it means to like different ways of portraying people, different ways of capturing the way they think. Even as an artist, what you can focus on differently. Like calling my attention to like how the way you think about things often has a big impact on so much more than just like, oh, getting some facts right or wrong, but rather it's like an entire way of being, entire worldview.
Right. Is that because when we think we have a line of reasoning and it's slow, and then when you're talking about a worldview, like you can think through specific actions you take, but a worldview encompasses everything. So like how you move, the things you notice, what you find important, where your eyes go to. So like when you're walking down the street, you might notice certain things if you have one worldview versus if you've got another worldview, you might notice different things and suddenly get into a conversation that someone with the other worldview would have never gotten into, or meet someone that the person with the other worldview wouldn't have met. But those things you can't be like, okay, where should I look? You can't break it down in that way when you're walking. Is that what you mean?
No. Yes, that's
Okay.
what I mean. Which, leaving aside the problems with the defining sense of life, I think that's what sense of life is supposed to stand for. What we're referring to when we say sense of life.
Yeah.
Leaving aside any problems with Rand's definition, that's the thing she's referring to.
The worldview.
Yeah, I think that's how I understand it.
The automated, the part that's automate, like all the tiny things that are automated and that you can't like pick out in any given moment. You can't, like, you'd be literally pause in the street for 30 minutes to try and deconstruct, like, should I look here? Should I look there? That kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah,
that's
cool.
the right idea.
And I was thinking about that recently. Like, if I'm walking down the street and it's rainy and cloudy and I start to feel depressed, it's not because it's like the realization that is my sense of life. I have some kind of worldview about rain and clouds, and it's not, someone else could walk down the street and go, this is amazing, and like, start dancing in the rain or whatever. So, but you can't, it's super interesting. You can't really break it like down. There's so many parts to it.
Yes, and that's why I mentioned like Nietzsche and Aristotle before. Like Nietzsche can get more into those emotional distinctions that, I mean, not the precision you would want usually of philosophy, but the ideas he throws out there seems very applicable to like how we react to the world, how we evaluate the world, and how our place in the world. And
What would you?
Aristotle being, go
Yeah,
ahead.
sorry, continue.
Well, as far as aesthetics and art, I think other philosophers can offer a lot as well. Like, I think Rand's very thin on her aesthetics. I
Yep.
like her views, but I think if you wanted a robust view on art, I mean, objectivism, I don't know if it offers very much. That's
Yep.
why I've always liked Aristotle or Nietzsche for that kind of thinking.
And, and Nietzsche is more the psychology, or what? What did you say?
Yeah,
Like,
more psychological, emotional, like a little not as quite objective, not as trying to be objective like Rand, but he has good observations, I think, that make
okay,
you think about what it means to, like the purpose of art, like what art does for you psychologically, how it affects you
okay.
psychologically, why it develops things like that.
Oh, so he does have, I wouldn't, maybe not a theory of art, but a lot of observations to make.
Yes,
Yeah, and then
yes, he
about
does.
people as well, right?
Yes, I think so. Yeah,
Do
like to
you?
what extent they might be like self-sacrificing, or to what extent they're giving into some like stupid way of looking at the world or something like that.
Do you find that you're able to apply more of you're able to apply a lot of Nietzsche's observations to observations you make of people and characters you read in fictional books? Like he might have a specific concept that he gives you about a pattern of behavior that you didn't have before, and then you're using it.
Yeah, within art, usually, yeah, there's
Okay.
certain dynamics I see with characters and dramas that I think are very telling about like some deeper observations he's made
Like
about psychology and people.
like what?
Um, More like trying to come to terms with your place in the world, with like grabbing life by the horns, basically, and controlling it to your will, bending it to your will, basically. It can explain usually like dynamics between villains and heroes, like why
Okay.
a villain is acts a certain way. It's not that they're just acting out of sheer hatred, but there's something motivating them, that they have reasons for what they do, even if we'd call them irrational, but we can still understand their behavior. We can still understand why people might react as the way they do to certain things, how they overcome their obstacles, and yeah, mostly how they overcome obstacles. I
Yeah.
think is a lot of what Nietzsche is, helps understand more of these, not just the broad observations of what art does, but specifically how artists implement different artistic visions, or how they implement their, or how to implement these characterizations, and like
And then
I'm trying to think of the master slave dichotomy, that of ways of looking at morality. He
right.
doesn't say either one's right or wrong, just that one's stronger than the other, but that's all he says. And that's also an interesting way to look at the behavior of other people. To what extent are they trying to call the bad things good just because it makes them feel good? Like Nietzsche thought that Christianity was really a rejection of Roman norms of virtue. So like being strong, like being virile and strong is immoral under Christian eyes. Like it's better to be self-sacrificing than under a Christian's eyes than it is to be their own way of being strong and powerful. So like
Right.
swapping your psychology about things so you feel better about it, even if it doesn't actually, like just as a way to handle like your place in the world.
There's a quote by um, Sartre. Let me just find it. Here we go. Those who lack the courage will always find a philosophy to justify it. That's Camus, actually.
Yeah.
So is it that sounds like what you're speaking about?
Yes, he was probably influenced
Rationalization.
by Nietzsche, to some extent. Like
Okay.
all the existentialists would, to some extent, would be influenced by Nietzsche.
So psychological observations and maybe some concepts about people and their patterns of behavior, and then interesting views on art is Nietzsche.
Yes, that's usually what I see him as.
Yeah. Okay.
He's more about asking questions and giving answers.
Okay. Like Hume.
Yeah, but more poetic about it. He's very flowery about his language.
Okay. But that I guess that could be good because maybe it's more memorable.
Yes, I mean, that's the value I get from Nietzsche. Not that I think he's right about a lot, but that he helps me ask good questions.
Oh, cool. What about, I was thinking about, I haven't read many Greek philosophers, but how do you find reading them specifically for their little stories that maybe help illustrate a concept? Just like you might read, for example, existentialist literature to capture what the arbitrary looks like, or particular metaphysical view of man. What do you think of reading Greek philosophers for the little stories like what is it, Gyge's Ring or Plato's Cave? I know Plato's Cave. I've read that.
That's almost all in the Republic.
Oh, okay.
That ring and the cave, those are both in the Republic.
Okay.
A lot of those are in the Republic. So, but that's why I want to read the Republic. I haven't read it. I want to read those examples in context.
Yeah.
I think it's valuable to have those because they give you ways to frame questions and a way to answer them.
Mm-hmm.
It gives you a coherent way to frame things. Usually
More
you hear
memorable.
about them in just like philosophy texts anyway.
Yeah.
Like the Ship of Theseus. I think I told
Yeah,
you about that one.
You mentioned that one to me.
Yeah.
And then Bed of Procustes as well. I don't know how to say it. Bed of Procustes. I don't know if it's made up, but Nassim Taleb talks about it. Let's see. It's based on a Greek myth, Bed of Procustes. Anyway, it's another one that I think it's an anti-rationalist. Yeah, it's Procrustean bed. It's this Greek guy who would have guests over, and he would make beds, and then to make sure that he tried to make his guests fit to the beds, so he'd like chop off their heads or their legs,
yeah, I remember
so
that.
They would fit, rather than fit the beds to the So that kind of stuff is pretty cool because it's like something so abstract. If I'm just putting it in all these terms, like this person has a malevolent view of the metaphysical nature of man, versus like you just tell a story. Like Kafka's Trial, maybe that's much better for you and for whoever you're explaining it to.
Yes.
Okay. All right, cool. I should, if I've got time, I'll definitely get into some of those little ancient Greek philosopher stories. All right. So another thing is I'm hearing the word, like I've joined a couple of groups that like meetups that talk about philosophy and stuff, and everyone always talks about structure, and I have no idea what that is. Like that term is thrown around so much, like social structure, power structure. It's all very vague, like structures in the mind, structures of beliefs. I have no idea what these people are talking about. I don't know. I'm not even sure if they do, to be honest, but it's like, have you heard, what do you think of that term structure?
When I hear it, I think organization.
Okay.
Like the organization of the mind, like how you could say structure of the mind, yeah, it's organized, but it's also, I think structure also conveys that it's a complex system. That's usually what I think when I hear structure, but also that it's an organization. So like you could have a structure of your corporate company, like CEO at the top and people doing deliveries at the very bottom, or whatever structure that might be. And you could have a structure of the mind, which would be the way that system is organized. And then you could have power structures being how power of individuals is used throughout society. Like how does the power of a CEO differ from say a part-time temp employee? Like what's their relationship in their power? Like how does one at the top influence the bottom? How does the bottom influence the top?
Right. Okay. Cool. I'm hearing that term a lot more, but I guess I could.
What kind of groups though? Just philosophy in general?
Yeah, philosophy in general, and there'll be like a lot of people who also study like Jung, Jung's
Yes.
psychology and that kind of stuff. And
Uh-huh.
obviously it's hard to, it's a pretty abstract term, and I've struggled enough as it is to really follow like even well explained abstract terms. So yeah, anyway, something to come back to.
Yeah, I would
Okay.
just stick to a complex organization of things.
Yes. Um, let's see what else. I got some just random questions for you before we get into all the other stuff. I was actually going to, I've created like a huge amount of files, and I'm going to start posting stuff too. So again, like written stuff. On the question of values, when you say something is a value to you, you know, like let's say you got a friend, we'll call him Johnny. Your friend's Johnny, and Johnny is a value to you because of his friendship. Like it's the friendship that's a value, right? And then you say Johnny is a value because of the friendship, but it's not that Johnny on his own is a value.
Mm. So you're saying like the activity versus the person. Is that what you're
Well,
saying?
it's the activity and the person, but in relation. Like it's not like if I'm. I was just thinking about like when I say Johnny is a value, do I mean I don't mean Johnny, I mean his friendship, and he's a value via his friendship. Or can you say Johnny is a value?
It's hard to see the distinction you're making. Like saying you value the friendship or you
Therefore, you
value,
value the
but
person.
Johnny is not himself the friendship. He's
Yeah.
not literally the friendship, but the friendship is what you value, but not. That's what you were asking, I think.
Well,
Yeah, I don't.
you value Johnny because of the friendship. But if you didn't have the friendship, could you say that? Could it be said that you value Johnny? Like, I'm just that's what I'm trying to get. Like, if you don't get anything from the person, can you say that you value that person and you don't speak to them? Because to me, it would be like, okay, so I have a friendship with Johnny and I value Johnny because of the friendship, but I can't just say I value uh, Johnny even if I don't speak to him.
I would think of it like I don't think you could divorce the friendship from Johnny. If you value him for his friendship, I think it necessarily means you're valuing him. Like you
Yes.
can't. You could value the friendship abstractly, but you know that the value itself is Johnny.
Yeah.
Like you're referring to Johnny.
Yeah.
Friendship is an aspect of Johnny, but you can't value just the friendship divorce of him. Or if you did, I think would lead to issues because you're trying to, on the one hand, value this abstract thing, platonic thing even, but not necessarily valuing Johnny, the concrete thing. So you kind of make a dichotomy in your head if you do that, because we know in reality it's referring to the same thing. Like the friendship is an aspect of Johnny. You're still valuing Johnny because he's the one who does the friendship. It's in his nature as the entity. The entity Johnny gives you the friendship. And if there were no friendship, there would be no Johnny in the same sense. You wouldn't be valuing friendship Johnny.
Yeah.
You could value Johnny in the sense maybe that he's a person you think it's good that people help build up society, but not much more than that. Like you can
Okay.
value people to the extent that you recognize that they're rational agents or they have the capability of being rational and that there's part of what makes society what it is.
Okay. So, I mean, that was my second question. Can you value Johnny divorced from the friendship? Which is because you said you can't value the friendship divorced from Johnny, but can you value Johnny divorced from the friendship? And it sounds like the answer is yes. For potential that he might do something for you. Is that it?
Perhaps, I mean, potential is maybe one way to look at it, but I mean, I would only do that, say that if, say, you didn't have a friendship with Johnny, like, supposing there were no friendship, could you still value him? It's like, yeah, you could value him to, in a broad sense, with like their impact on society or valuing that people can, something
The
more
impact on
abstract like society itself, which it wouldn't be as high a value, but it's a value nonetheless.
right.
And that would be a value, valuing Johnny for something besides friendship. But you could say you value additional aspects in addition to friendship with Johnny. You could say you could value him for the those things that all people share than the unique things about Johnny. But either way, you're valuing Johnny the entity. You're not. That's how you want to think about it. You value the entity. You know, it's not like you're valuing these abstract things outside beyond yourself. You're still referring to things in reality.
Okay. So then, even if you don't have the friendship with him, then you value the entity. If you think he's contributing something to society, and you think that's a bit broad, but you think then in turn you get something from that. Is that the idea?
Yeah, there's some mutual benefit there. I mean, a value ought to be something with beneficial to you and the other. It can get tricky there. To what extent would it be moral or rational to value something? But if there is some mutual benefit, definitely, that's a good reason to value something. That it enhances your life to some extent.
Okay. Cool. That makes sense. What about? Yeah,
Maybe
go
an
on.
additional concept to distinguish in there. I know Aristotle talks about friendship, and he makes distinctions like friendships of like just so you enjoy doing an activity, but that's about it. Like you enjoy them like in a utilitarian way. Like say you like to play chess with someone, and that's about it. It's not like you go into these, or another kind of friendship would be like more a true friendship that you value them for the entirety of their entity, I guess you could say, or you value them in a deeper way, not just a merely utilitarian way, but you value in some deeper moral sense.
Pragma. That's what it's
Well, you
called.
can think
I
of
think.
like, say, if you had a best friend, like you can
Sorry.
think of as like I think the distinction would be like, say, a friend that you like playing chess with, and that's about it, versus a friend that you share your more about you, or even friends that you maybe even lived with, or I know some people you might have like a friend as a roommate that they're so close to you, it's like they're a family member. I mean, there's different degrees of friendship, and you can even have the most general kind, which I mentioned about like people in general. Like you could value people generally, but there's a whole like way of hierarchy, I guess, of thinking about valuing people.
Yeah, I've read some of. I've got them planted on my wall. Those terms. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
We have one term which is interesting. We have six terms for coffee. You know, like flat white, cappuccino, everything else, and
Yeah.
then for love, we've got just one, which is. And then the Greeks had
Yeah.
like I don't know, it's 6 or 7, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. What about unrequited love then? So like, let's say you love someone, are they a value if they don't love you back?
Well, I should distinguish here that I mean, if you believe their value, that's enough for it to be a value. We can we can ask, is it rational? That might be the better question. Is it
Wait, what
a
do you mean if you
rational?
believe their value,
I
it's
mean,
enough?
like if you seek something and want it, that makes it a value. If you just want it, that's a value nonetheless.
If you seek something. Oh, actually, hang on a second, because yeah, isn't I remember the definition of values, um, something for which you want, but you also act to gain. And so, in the case of the person you don't speak to, what are you doing to act to gain that? That then it can't be said to be a value. And
Act
same
to
with the
gain or
love.
keep.
Like if you're not acting to act to gain or keep. Like in the same with the unrequited love, right? If you're not acting towards gaining and keeping it because it's unrequited, or if that person is not a friend, then how is they a value?
How would I phrase that? So the act to gain or keep. I mean, I guess in that sense, you could say that unrequited love, you are valuing them in a sense. Well, I guess you're still taking actions to some extent. Are you really not taking any actions? But yeah, if you were taking no actions whatsoever, I'd agree with you. It wouldn't be a value in any sense. But if it wasn't required love, usually it would entail something like, oh, you're maybe not pursuing other potential romantic partners, or it might mean that you're foregoing some other action in face of this purported value that it might cause you to act in certain ways to maybe attain that eventually. If you're doing absolutely nothing I think you're maybe right to say it can't even be called a value in any sense. Because you're not
I would
doing
say,
anything, then it's
yeah.
nothing.
Well, lack of action, like you're not pursuing anyone else, I would say is not an example of acting to gain and keep the person who you feel this unrequited love towards, because you might not be doing that with the plan of actually you just still think it's impossible, let's say. So in that case, I don't know, would you agree you still couldn't call it a value even though you feel this desire? So then there is a distinction between desire and value.
I think more in a normative sense, yeah. Like if it's a desire, I usually think value in like just keeping like keeping and having even. Like having seems like it would be part of value, but in just a descriptive sense, yeah, it would, a desire would be, yeah, it would be a desire. But in a normative sense, is it something you ought to value? Is it something good for your life? Clearly not. But I get what your question is. Is it, could it be considered a value? I think it should. I think having, wanting to have is so similar to keeping that I wouldn't want to presuppose that you have to have a value to say that you want it. I mean, that would be weird to say.
No, but to act towards to getting it. Like if we just look at animals, when they there's the goal and then there's the thing they're going towards, the value, and they're always there's no disconnect. Like at least we're not aware of animals going, oh, I wish I could, like a leopard going, oh, I wish I could eat that zebra, and just sitting there and falling asleep. Like they would chase it.
Yeah.
Whereas in our case, like we can disconnect. We can go, I want that, but I'm not going to do anything.
Well, I would
And
still
then
say, oh, go ahead.
we can say the same for the example you gave of Johnny, where like you value Johnny, but you don't know him or speak to him. In that case, how does that work? Because like you're not doing anything to gain or keep him in whatever sense that is.
I think I would disagree with you that like the non-action would be qualify as doing not acting. I mean, I maybe that's a rabbit hole to go into. Why is it that not doing something qualifies as doing something? I know it sounds a contradiction at first, but I think it still involves your volitional thought as a way to focus or not focus on something. I think it's more about that you can choose to focus on this value, on this thing, or not. You could put no focus on it, then yeah, it would be valueless. If there's no attention, then there's no value. That's more how I would phrase it. And unrequited love would be more like, even if you're not acting towards it at that moment, you're still directing your consciousness in some way. And that would be volitional. And that's in the sense you're choosing. You're choosing to focus on a particular thing.
Yeah, although if it is a matter of focus, just focus, then that would mean anything I look at is a value.
Potentially. I guess it would go into some extent like a sufficient amount of focus. But I'm still saying it's not like you're not acting. You're right. I mean, maybe I should say there's a limit to, or some amount of focus or a degree of focus we need to keep into account. Just, but more like not just like the focus of your eyes, but like that volitional focus that going beyond just like, oh, I see a green tree, but that you directing your consciousness and actions and thoughts to accomplish something or think about the tree.
We can talk about this later again as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'll write about it too. It'll be better because I can cover a lot of different scenarios. So, um, yeah, that is fine. The reason I'm asking like these questions, I started going through that section on virtue, and I'm definitely finding it feels a bit like a rabbit hole in that I'm reading it and I'm like, this makes sense, but I don't see it with the kind of clarity that at least Leonard Peikoff seems to see it with, because there are sections where he talks about like, if you do this, then it's like blowing off your head and then taking gold. I'm like, I don't get
Yeah,
what the
that's why I
hell.
really
Like,
like Ayn Rand's Normative Ethics by Tara Smith better than Peikoff for that purpose. For
okay.
understanding virtue, I found her much better.
Well, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying it that it's bad. I'm just saying if he's seeing it that vividly and I'm not seeing any of that, then clearly there's something I'm missing, at least in the way he's got to that point.
Yeah,
Because I'm like,
that's
I don't
probably true.
see, my head being blown off. If I could do this or do that, and I don't see the long-term consequences of it. A lot of the principles, so I can see it's like a rabbit hole, that it's not so simple. And when I say rabbit hole, I mean it's a rabbit hole you go down and can spend hours reading about, learning about, but you come out with no gold. You've just spent heaps of hours down there, unless you're very, very precise in trying to understand what underpins everything, like value and all these other epistemological concepts.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's where I'm at. So we can go to the reason chapter.
Yep.
What we have left. All right, so I've got a little, I think we can go to, you can just click on the table of contents, will take you down. Maybe I'll do a share screen, yeah? So we can.
Well, I have it open anyway.
All right, well, I will do it as is. Let's see.
So what are we looking at today? I think
Find
I
out.
see. EBO.
Okay, I'm just scrolling. I'll tell you what page it is once I scroll down far enough. I'll get to the. Oh, okay. So I think this is page 17. Probably only get through one or so.
Yeah.
Okay. Are you here where I'm at?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So he's saying, now let us note that information about the capacities of a species is not evidence for supporting a hypothesis about one of its members. By the way, is this the whole, something about some rule of logic where the whole is not the parts or the parts are not the whole? I can't remember what that is exactly, but does it relate to some law of logic?
It seems to be. I'm not positive.
Okay.
Or at least there's a fallacy related to that. And I don't know the name of it offhand.
Okay. The fallacy of composition, maybe?
Sounds about right.
The whole, the parts.
It's
anyway,
similar.
Whatever. Yeah.
It's not exactly the same.
Okay.
Because, I mean, to say that something about, say, one leaf on a tree doesn't necessarily mean you're, or saying something about the tree doesn't mean you're saying something about the leaf. Like, you can't base a conclusion just off of the whole. It's similar. But this is using just a capacity. Say, so you said man can swim. It doesn't mean, therefore, Johnny can swim. You have the capacity to swim. Well, that's different than, are you actually able to at this moment? Like, it's a potential in a way.
Well, here he's even saying that just because the species has it at capacity doesn't mean that even an individual has that capacity. Like, actually, I think okay. Because I'll give you he goes here, like, let's just read the thing. So the whole example was, he was talking about certainty and evidential continuum using the case of murder and like proving a negative and that kind of thing, which we covered. So from man is capable of murder, one cannot infer that maybe Mr. X is the killer we are seeking, which goes to your point of like, so everyone might have a capacity, but just because they have a capacity doesn't mean they're using it. But then here he says, it's possible for a human being to run the mile in less than 4 minutes, and it is possible for a living organism to reproduce after its kind. I cannot, however, go to a crippled gentleman in a wheelchair and say, maybe you'll give birth to a son next week when you finish running the mile to the hospital in 3.9 minutes. After all, you're living a human, and it is possible for such an entity to do these things. So like, these seem different for me. Like, one is all men have the capacity to do something, which is not proof that in any one instance they do it. And another is, just because the species has the capacity doesn't mean that any given individual or unit of that species has the capacity, which is different.
I think he's talking about species as in like genus differentia. I don't, just in case there's a miscommunication here. At first, I wasn't sure if he meant species as in like Homo sapiens.
I think that's what he
species.
means. What else? How in this context?
Well,
How
any
else
kind of genus species kind of relationship, not necessarily animals, I think. But anyway, it doesn't matter that much here. Just saying of the entire species, does it say something of the individual in there for a capacity? And I don't really see the difference in you're seeing. They seem constructed the same way. Man is capable. Man in general is capable of having kids and capable of running.
But and then I'll tell you what the difference is that I see anyway. Okay, so in this case, we're saying man can give birth, or like man has the species has the capacity to give birth and to run to the hospital, to run the mile in 3.9 minutes, because we've seen, some guy who runs very quickly and we've seen it being done. But the capacity in the species in general doesn't imply capacity in an individual. For example, a man can't give birth. So the species has the capacity to give birth, but man can't give birth. And the species has the capacity to run 3.9 minutes, but any given individual does not have the capacity to run 3.9 minutes. However, in this case, it says man is capable of what murder, maybe mixed X is the killer. What we're saying is all men are capable. Man is capable of murder, therefore all men are capable of murder. The issue is that you're not saying that this individual has committed murder. Do you see what I mean by like I'm seeing a difference in these two?
Yeah, I guess I do see the difference you're seeing now, in the sense that it's not even possible for a male to have a baby. I mean, it's not even like, even if he applied the capacity, like it still wouldn't happen. Like the capacity is there. It's just that, well, I think it still ends up being very similar anyway. I get it. It's like it's not even possible to have a man have a baby. But I still think it's saying that it depends. The individual involved depends on their specific circumstances. Like it depends being on male or female, and it depends on your physical ability to walk. I don't think it's saying much more than that. Just that, in general, there's that capacity. Well, I know you're saying like if they're not male, they have no capacity to have babies, but I think that's changing the usage of the word capacity. I think capacity in like man is capable of murder, that kind of capacity is just like, broadly speaking, anything in that category could do those things, all given what we do know about them, but in any general context. But sometimes the specifics might say that if an individual is incapable, if an individual is able to do so, which I think they're different ways of using the word capacity. Capacity is more I think it gets confusing there maybe, but
that term, capacity, when you take a word and you use it in two different meanings, there's some logic.
That's the equivocation maybe. It could be equivocation. It's hard to say. But I would say focus on just that last sentence. The claim depends on the individual involved and on the specific circumstances. And he's trying to go at like that idea that, oh, I could just be wrong, like you were saying about the RH factor. Like, what if there's some unknown factor? It's something like, well, it's possible that this could happen. So how could I really be sure? Maybe that's a bad example. Forget that.
With the I guess one thing is if it is, I guess it comes down to this, if it's an equivocation or not. But I was just thinking like, well, if it's true that just because the species has the capacity doesn't mean an individual does, that would mean you don't assume man is rational, because man has the capacity to be rational, but any given individual may not have the capacity to be rational, which is different from saying man has the capacity to be rational, but any given individual may not choose to act with that capacity. It's completely different, So that's where I'm.
Yeah, I think I have some things to clarify that. So I was more saying the equivocation might be yours, is why you might be seeing it differently than me, because you think you're treating capacity in the sense of the word the same way, but I'm saying there's two senses of the word capacity in both of these. That like you could have I understand like there's fewer limits on what can cause somebody to murder than giving birth. Like giving birth is pretty much only one factor that determines if you can.
Right.
But capable of murder is a lot more. So
Right.
I mean, I know you understand that much. So
Yes.
and
Right.
to take another step further, like okay, broadly speaking, they could. Just in general, all humans can. But then you could just take their specific circumstances. In a way, that's kind of getting at contextual certainty, like we were talking about before.
Right.
I mean, it's not like that we suddenly, oh, not every man is capable of murder because one person didn't. You don't say, oh, my previous knowledge was invalidated. Now I know that man doesn't really have that capacity, or we can't even make the claim.
The
But we
latter
know
part.
once we look, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying the latter part I get. Yes.
Yeah, so then you just go to the individuals, like just judge what the circumstance is. I mean, that's what determines like ultimately if that individual entity can. We know that the species can, that humans in general can, but can the individual not necessarily. And you just look at the individual circumstances.
So then, look, this is within that framework of like, okay, we're just going capacity being everyone has it, and we're just looking at has the given individual chosen to exercise that capacity in this circumstance. Then my question was, okay, well, um, if I think like that, then let's say I observe someone successfully studying psychology or understanding concepts from philosophy, then apparently would it then be invalid for me to go, that's possible to me because it's the capacity has been, oh wait, well that now I think I'm getting the same, I'm doing that same equivocation because there's a difference between me and another person having a capacity to do something versus him having a capacity and me not having a capacity. I don't know if that's clear to you, but I think I'm making that same mistake of like, in one case, let's say I'm saying my original question was like, I started having trouble thinking like, okay, well, if I see someone doing well at business or whatever else, would it then be invalid for me to go, I can do well too? Because that would be the same error, like the same thing that Peacock is talking about. But I'm starting to see that maybe my question was based on this issue I had at the start, which is confusing capacity. What do you think? If you want, I can try to clarify that a bit more. But
I think you're getting closer to the idea being conveyed here. Yeah, you could try clarifying it. Just let me see what your thinking is.
So my initial confusion was like, okay, well now suddenly I can't say just because I see someone succeeding at something, that means I can't say I can succeed at it. But now after what you've spoken about with this idea of possible equivocation with capacity, my thinking is maybe that's not true, that it's more an issue of like when you observe someone succeeding and you identify the capacity that they exercised in order to succeed, if you can, then it's not a question of maybe it's not a question of do you have that capacity, but will you exercise that capacity too? I don't know if that's any clearer. I probably need to sit down and think and write about
Yeah,
it.
I
But
think
it
it's
just
not too
confused me
far
because
off.
I used to always be like, if you see someone succeeding at something and you think they're similar to you in some way, like, oh, this is a human, like they make mistakes as well. And you're like, oh, I can do that also. I can succeed at that endeavor too. That was like a process of reasoning that I'd go through. But then after reading this, I thought, oh, maybe it's wrong.
The difficulty, I think, is trying to figure out what applies to the class in general versus what applies to specifically individuals. And that's certainly something you'd have to figure out. Like, does giving birth have to do with men in general or females in general, or is it specific to certain women, for example? Or
Right. Right.
but I mean, it's part of that's doing science or researching that claim further to know which it is. Like on some level, you still have to figuring out. But assuming that you did figure it out, then you can't logically just go, well, because we know man is in general is capable of reason doesn't mean the person who's exercised it, or say running 3.9 minutes on a whole mile. Yeah, we know that man can be put together or can, with the right things, accomplish that. But we still have to figure out what are the necessary ingredients to do that. We know that some combination is possible because we observed it, but we don't know to what extent individuals have all the necessary factors involved.
Right. Um, so I guess there is capacity, and then there are um, specific actions that someone has taken to cultivate skill, and or you said ingredients.
Yeah, but we could think
it's
of
hard to
like
distinguish.
penguins. Penguins, like birds are capable of flying. Penguins are not. It's, you can think of it that way too. Just because we're like, do we just say that, oh, we can never use flying as any important distinction? I mean, we could say that maybe it's not a good essential, but we can't just reason that based on like birds fly, therefore penguins do. You have to look at specific details about penguins, like I don't know, their weight or whatever, and you might realize, oh yeah, that's, we know birds generally are capable of flying, but it's not essential. So this is another way of looking for essentials, that we know that, I mean, if you could, if a female can have babies but men can't, we could say it's not essential because it doesn't explain the most about humans. There's a limit to what it can explain. But insofar as we're using it as a characteristic, we can't just logically say because one person did it, therefore everyone can. It would be overgeneralizing, perhaps.
Right. Yeah, I need to think about that one.
Yeah, but definitely recognize the connection with um, finding essentials. Because
Well,
we could say having a capacity doesn't mean it's an essential that everyone has.
right. What capacity? So I guess you'd need to do a lot of identification. Like if you see someone doing something, you'd need to try work out what capacity they exercised and then ask, do you have that capacity? But then more broadly, you could ask, are there humans with different capacity? Like what kind of differences in capacities are there? Like, I guess the essential attribute
Right.
for us is our reasoning, right? So
Right.
in
Because
that
that would be
case,
the
like,
thing. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, if that's the essential attribute, then apart from like, let's say, being able to run very quickly or do some kind of physical movements, maybe there is not, like you could, it does make sense to look at someone doing something, go, I could do that too. If I maybe putting aside, like, yeah, there's a capacity, but if I worked for 10 years or 20 years or whatever. So
Yeah, you could say, well, step one, be human. That's like one thing you need for that capacity. And you meet that at least. So you could say that way. But
yeah,
whether or not you have more about you that allows you, or as you're saying, maybe there's other capacities. We can't just say that we therefore know all the capacities. I mean, it's not a simple binary thing like you have it or you don't usually. It's more complex.
agree. It makes it really hard because we brought up the Iowa gambling task. Like, how do you know that there's not some kind of like background process of learning that you don't have a capacity to do? I don't know if that's even the right question to ask, but you get what I'm saying? Like suddenly it brings in all that to me.
Yes, it's really, yes.
I looked up the fallacy of composition, by the way. So arises when one infers that something is automatically true of the whole. I can true of the whole from the fact that it's true of some or even all parts of the whole.
Yeah.
This tire is made of rubber, therefore the vehicle of which it is also part of is made of rubber. But what about then, like you see a lady giving birth and then you're saying humans are capable of birth? Is that not the same? Like, how does that?
I don't think so. And in my head, they're kind of vaguely related, because, but not really clearly in my I can't really explain it clearly other than it was only like composition in the whole that because the general category of the class is more broad than the individual. So just because you're a member of the class doesn't mean, like, if you think of a species as part of the whole, part of all the whole, which is all men, you can't just say if all men are rational, therefore the individual members of that group do the same thing.
I didn't follow that example. Sorry. A species is the all men, right? Isn't that what the species?
Well, species being the broad category class, then the individuals within the class. So if you think of the
species is the class. Isn't the class the genus?
in this case, I think he's just referring.
I need to read this concept formation section. But yeah, anyway, is it so? Class isn't the genus.
I'm using different words here because I don't want to speak in terms of genus, species. Just think class, just as in type rather than individuals. So I'm just saying that if a class meant like all men, if all men were one thing, then imagine, like, does that mean all the men of that group also do it? Like, even if you got like 20 people, you could say that's the class man, but grab one of them, it doesn't mean, oh, the entire group can. Never mind. I don't have a good example. It's too metaphorical. I don't think it'll help your understanding. It's too metaphorical what I'm thinking. I'm not being literal, so. But I think you had the right idea.
I'll definitely need to explore this more to get it, because
it will make more. I can explain it better when we do some more studying other stuff. But for now, I'll leave it aside.
Yeah, there's tons more of these. I'll have to post on them.